Hello there. My name is Lauren Zulli, and I am the founder of Holos Coaching and Consulting. I'm thrilled to be here today to facilitate the session on workplace conflict. So, first, I want to thank Deb for inviting me here and for engaging me with her community. I hope this is the first of many conversations in how we can support each other in professional and personal growth. So, before we get into the meat of today's session, I want to give you a little bit more background about who I am and what I'm all about. So, my mission is really to help individuals and organizations unlock their potential and own their unique abilities. My coaching approach blends neuropsychology, energy management, and mindfulness to facilitate inner and outer success for individuals, leaders, entrepreneurs, and teams. I'm a certified professional coach. I have accreditations and certifications in energy leadership and psychological safety, and I also have advanced training in mindfulness-based stress reduction, somatic coaching, and embodied leadership. All right, that's enough about me. Let's talk quickly about logistics. As you can see, I'm recording in my apartment. I do have a dog, a sweet Berner, who is 85 pounds of pure joy. So you may see her walking around. Her name is Fable. She's great. But just want to let you know, we might be managing some distractions. I've got some notes over here that I'm looking at, and I've got some water over here that I'm going to be sipping on. I'm getting over, a bit of a cough right now. So I may stop periodically. With all of that said, there is a workbook that accompanies this training, so feel free to download that and work through that while I'm talking, or you can push it aside and come back to it at the end of the training. Whatever makes most sense for you. Okay, so here we go. Today's session is on workplace conflict. Yeah, often kind of taboo, a little uncomfortable, but something that happens often, right? Unfortunately, and it's also really important. It's important for growth for ourselves. It's important for growth as groups of people, but it doesn't really feel good. I mean, I can even feel in my body when I say the word conflict. It's like, ooh, But that's important. That's important feedback for us to understand, because the more that we can recognize triggers in the world, the better off we're going to understand ourselves and be able to manage our energy when we're walking into a place of conflict. So today, what we're really going to do is focus on unpacking the complexities of conflict in the workplace and go beyond the surface level conflict to look at core social drivers of the brain. We'll look at our brain's need for safety, which is really important, and we'll also look at how conflict shows up internally and externally, as well as how to address conflict in the moment and proactively so that we can minimize stress and maximize collaboration, creativity, productivity, and our overall well-being. So, at the end of today's training, you will hopefully have an understanding of what conflict is, how it rises, why it exists, and then you'll learn a 4-step process for addressing conflict in the moment, as well as discovering proactive strategies to get ahead of it. All right, so what is conflict? Well, in general, conflict is defined as a struggle between two opposing forces, either between yourself or others and your environment. And here's the deal. Emotions play a key role in interpersonal conflict, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that. And because we're human and we're emotional beings, we have bias. And because we have bias, conflict will exist. So unfortunately, it's unavoidable, which means that we only have one choice, which is learn how to address it. So why don't we jump in and learn how to address conflict so we can ease some of that discomfort and move forward constructively. All right, so how does conflict show up? Let's first talk about internal, and then we'll move to external. Internal conflict really happens when there's misaligned or incongruent thoughts, feelings, values, emotions, or actions. This internal conflict can go on for minutes or possibly years, until we've actually had the time and space to step out, look at it, and understand what the root of the conflict is. Working with counselors, therapists, mentors, and coaches can help you find effective ways to actually move forward. So here's the deal. External conflict and internal conflict are kind of tied together hand in hand. The more that you can understand about yourself internally, the better you're going to be able to express yourself externally, right? So it's almost important to tackle both of them together. External conflict, on the other hand, is really about where you find yourself in struggles with other people or groups of people and your environment. And this generally signals, just like internal conflict, incongruent value systems or belief systems, and even unmet needs. So let's look at some examples that really where conflict can rise, right? So we've got personality differences is one big area, perceived inequalities, lack of clarification on roles or projects, poor communication or misunderstanding, that's a big one. Unidentified or unmet expectations, that's another whopper. And then there's always the inability to fulfill or implement a job because you don't really have the necessary resources. That's another issue as well. So those are just some examples. I'm sure you could probably come up with other examples, and maybe we'll talk about them as we go along. But let's go ahead and pivot into why conflict exists. So this is an important piece of it because we're going to dive into kind of like the interworkings of you and your brain. So as I mentioned, because we are human, we are all very diverse. We're diverse in our perspectives, our experiences, our value systems, our belief systems, and because all of that occurs, there will be prejudice, bias, and judgment. So essentially, conflict is unavoidable. So let's talk about how bias emerge, because they're here, right? What is it? Why is it here? So this is a little bit about Brain Science 101. All right, for starters, our brain evolved at a much slower pace than society. In the Middle Ages, we were constantly under threat, right? We were running from saber-toothed tigers. We were fighting other tribes for shelter, and we were hunting arduous lands for food. We were perpetually in this state of fight, flight, or freeze. But fast forward today, and we pretty much function day to day without these same threats. However, the brain hasn't evolved at the same pace as society. And so over the years, it's learned how to maximize its ability to survive by constantly scanning the environment for threats. So basically, your brain's primary focus is to detect and react to things that threaten our survival. And because we're wired to look for threats, the brain perceives and responds to physical and psychological threats the same way. So for instance, a physical hit to your body actually resonates the same way as a psychological hit to your body. It's pretty powerful. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the non-conscious brain. Your non-conscious brain has pretty much evolved to help maximize efficiency. We have so much information coming into our brain at every second of the day that we can't possibly process all of it. So your brain wants to do this more as efficiently as possible, and it automates everything. So that really happens at a low level of consciousness and actually below the level of consciousness. And because of that, there's actually a negativity bias. So you've got scanning for threats, you've got efficiencies and shortcuts that are happening. All of this really creates a storm for conflict, not just internally, but externally. I also want to note that because we have a negativity bias, we're actually 5 times more likely to see a threat in our environment or a negative situation than we are to recognize a positive situation. So for instance, Any of you that are a business owner or maybe an employee that had a performance review or a business review, chances are you remember those negative reviews more than you do a positive review. That's your negativity bias showing up. All right, so we talked about threats in the environment. We talked about the negativity bias. Let's go ahead and talk about how these start to create conflict then. So because our biases were created from past experiences, this actually becomes a filter to which we see the world. So our unconscious biases can influence how we perceive a threat and can automate our responses to the threat, which are often irrational and unwarranted, not really helpful. So when you think about conflict and when you're addressing it, a lot of the times we get triggered and then we just go into this automatic response mode that's non-conscious and not helpful rather than conscious, logical, and growth-oriented. Not a great thing. But the thing is, we can get ahead of this. And the more that we can understand our need for safety, because we do scan for threats, the better off we'll be. And so if we can identify the triggers, then we can start to put ourselves back into the driver's seat of our own brain. So let's talk about understanding the brain's need for safety. There are 6 dominant social drivers of the brain. We're going to talk about 5 of them. Well, we'll talk about all 6, but there's 5 that are very distinct, and then there's a 6th one, which is really you, which is very subjective. But anyway, so the brain's need for safety. The first one is security, okay? And this is really about our need for predictability and certainty. Our brain wants consistency because change in general is basically seen as a threat. It's danger, right? Change, no thank you, don't want that. So because change goes against your brain's natural default wiring system, the brain wants to make sure that our world is familiar, clear, consistent, and concise. All right? And so a threat to your security will often bring you into a state of being triggered, and then that can create some conflict. Another area of the safety domain is what we call autonomy. All right, and this really relates to feeling like we need to be in control, whether it's real or perceived. You want control over your choices, over yourself, over others, and your environment. I've got a high need for autonomy. Yep. So here's the deal though. The lack of control in a brain really actually has an impact of you feeling helpless. Have you ever heard of the whole victim mentality state? Yeah. Basically, when you hear that, that's because somebody has been triggered by their autonomy need and they feel completely helpless. And interestingly enough, research has shown that helplessness has actually been correlated to both health of the brain and the body. So when you feel helpless, often you actually feel that in your body somewhere. So a trigger to your autonomy, safety need, can really put you into a place of conflict. All right, let's move to the third one. That's fairness. And this is our need to experience fair exchanges. Essentially, we've developed a brain that values fairness and activates disgust when situations are unfair. So disgust is actually a powerful brain emotion that signals something may be dangerous. So essentially, when we've been treated unfairly, our brain perceives that there may be a threat in our environment. So all of you folks out there that fight for injustice, you probably feel it pretty hard when essentially your brain's safety need for fairness has been triggered. And then you feel the need to fight, which could potentially put you into a conflict mode. All right, let's talk about esteem. So esteem is the 4th area as part of the safety model that we talk about. And this is the domain that really relates to how we see ourselves or how others see us and how we compare ourselves to others. So putting it simply, it relates to our perception of the external world in relation to ourselves. And when we perceive or feel that others regard us highly, the reward center of our brain is activated. And research has actually shown that children with a low sense of esteem have they've associated this with decreased emotional regulation later on. It's also actually increased pain and inflammation as well. So the thing is that when you experience social rejection, your body actually becomes inflamed and you really start to lose any control over your emotional abilities. Okay, let's talk about the fifth one. This is trust. So this domain really talks about our social needs. And research has shown that our brain categorizes things in people as either an in-group or an out-group, right? Friend or foe. You've heard that before, right? So when people are similar to us, we immediately see them as a friend, and we tend to empathize with them. However, when we see people who are dissimilar to us, the brain categorizes them as out-group or foe, and we see them as a threat. So think about somebody who has a high safety need for trust, probably doesn't really like to hang out with people who are not like them, right? They probably do different things, their hobbies are different, or maybe their interests are different because they see it as a threat. So recognize this and you can get ahead of conflict. Okay. So in addition to the brain's need for safety, we just went through 5 of those, we're going to talk about the 6th domain, which is really you. And what encompasses you is really your identities and your value systems, okay? And those can cause biases too. The identities that we create individually and as part of society fuel biases and judgments about how we see ourselves and how we see others. Some of the ways that we identify with ourselves and associate other people are through age or race, sexual orientation, biological gender, gender identity, mental, emotional, or physical disabilities, even like ethnicity, job titles, socioeconomical status, faith traditions or religion, family structure even. Those are just some examples of how we identify ourselves and how we see others as well. And that all can really cause conflict if we don't see hand in hand or we value those differently. Now, our own personal value systems can also cause bias, which can cause conflict. And the way I like to define values is really our own unique personal operating principles. Your value systems, conscious or unconscious, is really like your light, your compass for life, right? So sometimes, or anytime I would say, you feel like your value isn't being met or it's being challenged by someone, chances are conflict is there, okay? So for instance, I really value open-mindedness. And when I meet somebody who tends to be a fixed mind or closed off to possibilities or opportunities, I feel really triggered by that. And generally that can put me in a place of conflict, right? So, okay, what we just did is we went through 3 particular areas of how biases emerge that can create conflict. We first talked about safety, so your brain's need for safety, and then we talked about identities and values. Before we move on to the next section, I want to encourage you to embark upon an exercise that can help you understand and look at this, right? So one way you can look at this is identify your top 5 values. And after you've identified your top 5 values, list where they're being upheld in your life and where they may be challenged in your life. Chances are you will find that where your values are being challenged are the same places where there could potentially be conflict. And I would also wager a bet that you probably don't feel very psychologically safe when you are in those scenarios either, which probably means that some of your brain's safety needs might not be met either. So I'm talking about that security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, and trust may possibly be triggering you as well. So, and there's more on the workbook that you can walk through and look at to try to identify what you think your biggest domain is from a safety need. So the thing is that the good news is that creating psychological safety within interpersonal relationships can help to develop trust and respect and confidence. And you'll probably be more likely to bring your whole self forward and not fear any type of retaliation. Generally, when safety is established in a relationship, it has the potential to really improve the collaboration among you and your team members. It actually can improve creativity and performance. And as I mentioned before, it can overall help you increase your well-being for yourself and for your team members. So if you would like to learn more about your unique safety needs, please feel free to reach out to me after the training. We can put you through the assessment and we can debrief you so you can really get into the nuts and bolts of it. Okay, so let's go ahead and pivot on to the conflict strategies, and then we'll just close out and see where you go from here. So with each opportunity comes the ability to grow and learn, right? So every opportunity with conflict, you have a choice. You can lean into it and learn from it, or you can shy away from it, avoid it, and never really learn anything. So as a business owner, as a manager, as an employee, we have a duty here to show up. So I've developed an acronym for addressing conflict in the moment and proactively so that you feel strong and confident. And that acronym is called LEAN IN. So LEAN stands for label, explore, adopt, and negotiate. IN stands for identify and nurture. All right, so we'll go through the 4-step process, which is LEAN, for addressing conflict in the moment, and then we'll move over to the 2-step process, which are really the strategies in for proactively addressing conflict before it happens. All right, so LEAN. L stands for label. This means label your emotions, label your feelings. As I mentioned, conflict can be very emotional. By labeling the emotion that shows up, you really disarm the power of your lower brain in taking over the situation. So when we identify how we feel, it gives us the ability to objectively step outside the situation and enables us to re-engage logically in a growth-oriented manner. Okay, so that's step 1. Step 2 is explore. Explore the source of the conflict. So once you've been able to neutralize the feelings and emotions around it, it's time to really get involved and explore the core concern underpinning the conflict. Get super curious here. What was it about that situation that really rubbed you the wrong way? What triggered you to feel that way? Remember, the brain is wired for safety, so explore your non-conscious expectations or needs and how they may not have been met, which led to the conflict. The 3rd step is adopt, and this means to adopt a new perspective. So in this step, you are taking another vantage point other than your own, right? And it's really hard, but this is where we want to open up the blinders. We want to increase our capacity to empathize and really actively engage in empathetic listening to hear the other person's perspective, right? Because there's always 2 perspectives in the equation of conflict. All right, so here it's essential to understand what the motivators and the drivers are, not only of yourself, but the other person, so you could properly move forward. So understand, embark, embrace the newness of somebody else's perspective. Step 4, after you've labeled your emotions, explored the source, adopted a new perspective, you want to negotiate. All right, and you want to negotiate a path forward. So this is a whole thing about activating a win-win attitude, right? So from an energy management perspective, you don't want to be a bull in the china shop, right? Energy in equals energy out. If you go in like a bull in a china shop for your conflict, what do you think is going to be the resulting action? Broken dishes, right? Not great. But if you go in with soft hands and you're coddling and nurturing the china shop, you'll walk out with a clean set of, china. All right, so the intention here around negotiating win-win is really proactively responding to the conflict so that you look at it in terms of helping and supporting the other person meet their goals or their objectives, right? So what you want to do is explore and understand, how do I meet my needs and your needs in a way that's going to move this constructively forward? All right, so that's the lean model. That's to be used in the moment when conflict arises. Now let's look at how you can adopt some strategies that are going to be proactive and help you get ahead of conflict. Because essentially, we don't want to deal with it in the moment, right? Ideally, we would not have to deal with it, but since that is unavoidable, let's look at those strategies so that it puts you back into the driver's seat and hopefully can make a more effective engagement with anybody you're working with. So that acronym is IN, right? We talked about lean, now we're moving to IN. So the I stands for identify, and this means to identify expectations and establish an agreement for your project or your engagement. So whether you're a business owner, an employee, a work team leader, it's really helpful to make the implicit explicit so that there's a mutual understanding and respect that's built into the foundation of any relationship. So here what you want to do is really clarify your client or your work team leader or your employee's needs. Clarify your communication style, understand what the overall vision is, what is the goal, what is the objective, and the expectations. So get that right up front and be clear and concise about that. Then the next step from a proactive standpoint is to nurture, right? N is nurture. And that means to nurture the relationship with ongoing feedback and routine check-ins. Nobody likes to get to the end of the year or end of a project and have a terrible review and you have like no idea why that happened, right? So you don't have to have it that way. Check in consistently and establish a cadence, right? So it's really vital to establish that cadence of communication so you see what's working and what's not. A simple framework to use is really stop, start, continue, right? So stop doing what's not working, start doing something that's going to have better benefit for the engagement, and then continue to do what's working for you. And do this often, as frequent as you possibly can. So a month into a 6-month engagement, check in with your client, check in with your new employee, check in with your boss and say, hey, we established the foundation in the beginning. How are we working? Good? Do we have to switch this and iterate? Okay, awesome. That way, every step of the process, you really know where you stand. All right, so we talked about a lot today. I'm just gonna quickly summarize and then we can close up. So, for starters, conflict exists because we are human, we are emotional, and we are biased. Conflict exists internally and externally and are often very much intertwined. External conflict shows up because of triggers in our brain's need for safety, as well as challenges in our identity and our value systems. And then lastly, you can respond to conflict in the moment and proactively in a positive and constructive way using the Lean In model. So label your emotions, explore the core conflict, adopt a new perspective, negotiate a win-win, and then identify the expectations and the needs, and then continue to nurture the relationship. So thank you for tuning in today. I hope this was valuable for you. I really enjoyed the opportunity to share this content with you. As I mentioned before, if you would like to dive into your own personal safety needs, feel free to reach out to me. We can even unpack energy and how it relates to you, what's working for you, what's not. I have assessments, coaching, trainings available for yourself, for teams, for leaders. And if none of that is really interesting to you, just say hello. I'd love to hear how this resonated with you and even what suggestions you have to move forward. All right, take care, everyone.